Welcome to the Education Innovators Podcast. I'm Eric Byron, and it is my privilege to host this show where I get to talk to folks from all over the world who are education thought leaders and innovators. We'll hear inspiring stories from educators, EdTech founders, AI experts, and others who are fearlessly innovating and delivering unique learning experiences. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started.
Engagement is not about compliance. Engagement is about people doing what they do because they want to do it, have a need to do it, and are willing and eager to shine when they do it. That's motivation. And so to create that, you have to create an environment where people come to the table wanting that for themselves. So you got to select the right people.
That was Dr. Roger A. Gerard, and he has a wealth of experience in people leadership. I'm talking like 50 years of experience leading people. And I got to talk to him about his most recent book, which is titled Lead with Purpose: Reignite Passion and Engagement for Professionals in Crisis. So this was a conversation just full of wisdom and practical advice for dealing with teacher burnout and lack of engagement, and to help us all be the kind of leader we want to be. So keep listening. I promise this one's going to be worth it. All right. Welcome to the Education Innovators Podcast. I'm Eric Byron, and I am joined today with Dr. Roger A. Gerard. He is the owner of Sloan Gerard Consulting, a private consulting practice serving executives and boards in strategic planning, operational planning, executive coaching, and management development. He also specializes in process improvement and the use of lean methodologies in bringing about significant and measurable organizational improvement. He's a former chief learning officer for ThedaCare, if I said that right, and integrated. Oh, good. An integrated healthcare delivery system, retiring from that position back in 2014 after 23 years in that role. So Dr. Gerard is the author of Owning the Room, Leading with Mind, Heart, and Spirit to Make Extraordinary Choices in a Demanding World. And his forthcoming title, Lead with Purpose: Reignite Passion and Engagement for Professionals in Crisis. And that's a book I had a chance to read, and we're going to focus on that for most of this conversation today. So welcome to the show, Roger. You excited?
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. I'm pleased to be here.
Good, good. This is going to be fun. All right, let's warm up a little bit with just a question that helps us get to know you and what makes you tick. So you spent kind of a lifetime really in HR and dealing with people management. So how did you end up on that track? And did you always want to be in HR, or did you start out with other ambitions?
Great question. When I was a child, I was the oldest of 10 in a family in Michigan. Dad was a factory worker in an automotive plant, and I was actually destined to join the ministry. I spent 7 years in a seminary setting and really cared about living a life focused on people and spirit and that kind of stuff. I left that track and moved myself into more of an education framework and joined professionally through the 70s, 3 different healthcare-based organizations, the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Society, and learned about leadership, not just as the oldest of 10 kids, but also in those voluntary agencies, recruiting and training volunteers to do all kinds of good work in the Michigan arena, much of it in the Detroit area. I eventually became director of field services for the Cancer Society And not only was recruiting volunteers and creating local boards of directors and so on, but I was also supervising a staff of professionals in that regard. And in that process, decided I needed to learn more about leadership and about the working with people. I went for my master's degree and then eventually a doctorate later in life, all focused on organizational behavior and the motivation of people in that process. I did several stints as director and senior VP of human resources, much of it in the healthcare industry, and landed at ThedaCare as chief learning officer, working with medical and technical executives, managers, and staff in the learning processes. As in any professional environment, people have to keep themselves up to speed, learning and training all the time. And I became kind of the center of making sure that happened in the organizations I was working with. I also did quite a bit of community work, bringing together educators from colleges and universities, and even working with high schools and preparing the ground for new professionals coming into the professions in the organizations I was working in. So I've always had an affinity for helping people map out their future, and particularly in the world of learning and education.
Yeah.
After I retired from ThedaCare in 2014, I launched my consulting business. I had been dabbling in consulting on the side for some time and did that robustly and had many clients, both in healthcare and outside of healthcare, including in the educational forum.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, you clearly have a spirit for, serving and for helping people. So, I think this is great. And well, let's get into some of the stuff in the book, because I do want to,
Sure.
there's so much to cover here. There were so many things that I read in there and I went, oh yes, I've dealt with this. So, and just so you know, my background, I'm also kind of corporate background as well. We'll talk about this. I spent 11 years at Disney, and I know you
Hi.
actually mentioned Disney at one point in the book as
Yes,
a
I did.
positive example of professionalism there.
Yes.
But yeah, and I worked in IT and technology, corporate enterprise stuff, and then ended up in the video game industry. But all along, I was also kind of teaching on the side. I taught computer science courses in university, but then I got involved as kind of an education liaison, sounding similar to some of what you were doing. So working with schools and curriculum advisement, if you will, to try
Sure.
and help make sure that folks coming up through their education were going to be prepared to work in jobs in digital media and entertainment. So
So we're
anyway,
professional brothers.
yes, yes. So, and all of my career, I have had to deal with people issues. And I've always said, even though I worked in technology, the technology doesn't matter. It's all about people.
No,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah. So, all right. So, all right. One of the things that we can just start right out, because I think this is a good one to kind of cut our teeth on in this discussion,
Yeah.
is the role of leaders to motivate teachers, or should they have their own intrinsic motivation to teach?
Love the question. And no, it's not the role of leaders to motivate others. Nobody motivates me to get up on Monday morning and have an interview or Tuesday morning to have an interview with Eric Byron. I do that. You had the courtesy of inviting me into this process, but I made the decision. I take the responsibility, and what you and I do with this is completely up to us. I take the position that motivation is actually intrinsic. When we make it extrinsic, what we're doing is we're not motivating, we're manipulating. Those are very different words. And what happens when you manipulate? Well, when you put strings on people and start pulling those strings through incentives or however it is you want to do that, fear, what you create is a fear-based transaction as opposed to a positive willingness to engage. Engagement is not about compliance. Engagement is about people doing what they do because they want to do it, have a need to do it, and are willing and eager to shine when they do it. That's motivation. And so to create that, you have to create an environment where people come to the table wanting that for themselves. So you got to select the right people. And then number two, you've got to create the environment where that is rewarded and cultivated and nurtured over time. Everything else is manipulation.
All right. So I
Uh,
want to dig a little deeper on
go
this,
for
though,
it.
before you
You
go too
bet.
far into some of the other things a leader should do.
Yeah.
So, my own personal experience, I recall when I was first moving up through the management ranks myself, right? And having senior management basically beaten me up saying, you got to motivate your people. They're not working hard enough, right? They're not getting enough stuff done, and you're not getting their best work. So go motivate those people. And this was a pretty constant theme early on in my experience as a young leader trying to figure this out, right? So I get this group of people, and I didn't disagree. They could be doing more. They could be doing better, could be higher performing team, but I was challenged to go motivate them. So how often have
Yep.
you run into this, and how do you kind of help from a consulting side with that?
Yeah. What you're describing is Taylor-esque in its genesis. So we can go back hundreds of years. The psychology that you're describing among leaders is not a new psychology. I worked with one client who will remain nameless, but his theme song was "You get paid, don't you? Go do it." What you have to recognize is that most people, when they come out of their academic world, whether that be high school, college, or advanced education, they come into the workplace already motivated. They want to do good work. They want to shine. They want to show that they learned something and that they've got skills and that they can bring value. If you're not hiring those people, the problem is you. So that's the first step. The second step is once you have them, you got to maintain that energy. And how do you do that? You give them an opportunity to shine. It's your job as a leader to cause people to be successful beyond their wildest dreams. If you can't do that, well, why would they try? I did a survey in one large organization, and I found out that the least motivated people were the folks who had been there for 2.5 years.
Okay.
And my question was, what are we doing to those people after we hire them that in that 2.5 year period, their motivation just went flat, just totally died. Suddenly they became compliant employees instead of motivated employees. They didn't start that way,
Hmm.
but that's a leadership issue. Leaders create that effect through how they treat the relationship. If you treat the relationship with your people as a transaction, then you're going to get a transaction. If you treat it as a relationship of professional colleagues practicing their professions and learning as they go, that's what you're going to get. It starts with the leadership mindset. But you're right in pointing out that there is a lot of bad modeling out there, and it's everywhere. The Taylor-esque models come from the 1910, 1920 time frame, where it was all about clipboards and productivity measurement and human dynamics in the creation of work. Those days are gone. And leaders who are still managing that way don't understand the human enterprise. What's happening today is people are making better choices about where they choose to do their work. It's just the whole controversy today about working at home versus working in the office is a great
Yes.
example of how people are saying, look, I want to organize my professional work around my needs too, not just the organization's needs.
Yeah. So this, well, it brings up several interesting discussions for me because part of my experience, right, is, obviously I have a fairly lengthy career too, and I have seen a lot of this But it's not just a legacy problem. In more recent years, I've worked with some startups. I worked in the video game industry, and you would think, now this is a very creative, environment. I worked at Electronic Arts. They hire the best of the best of the best, Men in Black kind of thing going on there. But
Sure.
they still had some of these challenges of leaders who, measured, your number of hours that you were on site. This was their metric for how hard are you working? How many hours are you here in the building? And, these challenges still exist. And I have worked with startups where you have founders who do the same thing, right? They're clocking people and saying, oh, if you're not working 100 hours a week, you're not passionate, and, you're not, you don't belong here, right? If you're going to do a startup, you got to be ready to die for, this startup. And, and I've worked with some of the people and go, that's not the right metric. You're kind of measuring the wrong thing. You hired these people, let them do their thing and do it the way they want to do it. So how do we, if we've known this stuff for a long time, right? You've been studying it for a long time. I've been aware of it for a long time. Why is this still such a struggle, and why almost more now I see, people complaining that they have this staff of people who are disengaged, and they're, laying down on the job, as they call it, or quiet quitting or whatever. There's all these different terms for it. Why are we still struggling with this so much, Roger?
Yeah, bad behavior rolls downhill. Okay, and so you got to go all the way to the top when you're having these kinds of issues in organizations, and to the top. I'm not just talking about the CEO and the senior executive team. I'm talking about the board. What happens is we have this mythology in leadership that says, if I set objectives, if I create goals, then everything else is going to follow. It's not how life works. Life is messier than that. Yes, we have to have goals. Yes, we have to have standards of performance as we do things. Yes, we have to have metrics. But we also have to understand that it's all an illusion. Because when you get right down to the daily work, things don't work the way we planned on how things should work. People have to exercise judgment. They have to understand that there are going to be unexpected obstacles. There are going to be times when the best laid plans were totally bollocksed and totally wrong. What has to happen is leaders have to have a mindset that says, okay, we can set something in motion, but now we have to trust the people doing the daily work to do that with their own best intentions and with their own best ways of doing things, because they are the professionals, not the executives. I made it a practice in my work when I was in an administrative role to spend a day a month wandering around with the professionals in the organization. I would track a nurse for a day. I would track a lab tech for a day. I would track a records person for a day, and just be there and watch and understand what they were dealing with, so that I could figure out a way to make things easier and more effective for them, not for anybody else, for them. And over time, I got to know a lot of people, and I got to know what was being done, and it helped me create environments in the organization where people could talk to me and tell me what was going on, and also get the help they needed. What you're describing when you describe that top-down reality is you're describing leaders who have no trust in their professionals. They don't trust them. And if they're not trusting their professionals and creating these kinds of demands, what you're going to see is that I call it the dinosaur effect. These executives will be dinosaurs in today's world. The world's messier than that, and everybody else knows it. There's a reason why there's such a turnover in leadership ranks in many industries. There's a reason for that. They burn out, and because they're not getting the cooperation they need because of their own behaviors in the process. When I was going through my doctorate, I was 50 when I was finishing my doctorate. And as I was going through that, I had a faculty member parading across the stage in front of this auditorium, walking back and forth saying, "You must demand respect. You must demand respect." That was his key message as part of his symposium presentation. And it was like, excuse me, but that's not my reality. And I was a senior exec at the time. No.
Yeah.
If I were to go into a medical environment and demand respect, I'd be out of there so quickly.
Yeah. And that's
I had
funny.
to earn it. I
I,
have to earn it.
yeah. What popped in my head was a phrase I learned in consulting, right? Was they don't care how much you know, they want to know how much you care. Right?
Yes.
So it
Yeah.
doesn't matter if
That-
you're an expert, you can come in and you can solve some problem for them if they don't believe you care about them, right? And their problem, not corporate's problem. Corporate wants to make more money, that's a whole different kind of thing, right?
Yeah, corporate should want to make more money. That's what the business is there for. The stockholders are going to tell you that. But the business has a dual mission. It's not just the profit potential for the business, but it's also the service potential for the business. Every business has to please not just the shareholders of the business, but they also have to please the community they're there to serve. They have to. I don't care if you're a restaurant, a hospital, a manufacturing plant. You've got that dual mission. It's part of the reality. Board members sometimes forget that. CEOs sometimes forget that, and they only focus on what's easy to measure. You talked about measuring, time on task. That's easy to measure. The profits are easy to measure. You can measure the dollars. What you can't measure easily is engagement. You can't measure things like loyalty and love and harmony and friendship. You can take a stab at it. You can work around the edges of it, but you can't measure it. You can't put it in front of you on your desk and see it like
Yeah.
you can some of these easier metrics.
Yeah. No, there's some really interesting phenomenon too that, I've seen over the years, and I'm sure you've seen. Well, I want to talk about some examples of where things are really working because it can be a very negative discussion, right? Because there's so
Sure.
many examples of what's broken out there, but I want to focus more on the positive, and I want to also make sure, right, that we're focusing a bit around education, and it doesn't have to be school education. It can also be corporate, learning and development as well. But, I really want to kind of hone in on this aspect of how we develop people, right? So,
Right.
because it's one thing to hire somebody, right? And they come in, they have a certain skill set, and hopefully they have the right mentality and passion. And, I know you take some time in the book to kind of define what a professional is, right? So if you're hiring professionals, right, now you've
Oh,
still care and feeding, right? The world is changing so fast. We're constantly having to train and develop and give people space to grow. So how do we create that environment? And maybe you've got some examples of organizations that have done this really well.
oh, sure. I think both academic, the academic industry does it fairly well in some ways. There are pluses and minuses there. The healthcare industry does it fairly well, but there are some pluses and minuses. I don't know anyone out there that's doing this perfectly. But we can take the best of these different industries and kind of amalgamate them and talk about some of the best practices that are out there. We know that learning takes place in three fundamental ways with professionals. The first way is the academics. There's a knowledge that you have to accrue professionally in order to be able to declare yourself as a professional. And so you go to school and you take classes and you go to conferences and you absorb the knowledge of the professionals who have been there and have done that and they're around. That's a good way to learn, but it's maybe 20% of the game or 30% of the game. Second way is to hook yourself to somebody else's wagon, and by that I mean, find a mentor, maybe many mentors. I did back in my 30s and 40s. I got some beautiful advice from one of my bosses. He said, "You need a board of directors." And I said, "What are you talking about?" I'm building boards in my work. And he
Yeah.
said, "No, no, no. You need five or six advisors, not just me as your boss. You need about five or six other people to advise you and counsel you as you grow yourself as a leader." That was probably one of the best pieces of advice I ever got in my entire career. And I did that. And I built a group of mentors who kind of shepherded me. And anytime I had a major problem or decision or something I had to act on in my career, somebody on my board would get a call, and I would, work it out and then act. I learned patience with myself, and I learned how to learn.
Hmm.
The third way beyond academic and mentoring is to immerse yourself in learning by doing. And I think that's probably 70% of the game with most of us. We take on a challenge and we stretch ourselves. We do things we've never done before. In an environment where there's a great deal of fear and anxiety over meeting goals and corporate objectives, it becomes less desirable to take the risk of doing something you've never done before. And so the best practice organizations out there kind of take the threat out of that. They kind of take the anxiety out of that by expecting people to stretch, expecting people to try new things, expecting people to innovate. And then when things go wrong, which it's going to happen, they reward people for the learning instead of punishing them for the mistake.
Mm.
That's very difficult, but I've seen that done, and I've had to do that myself.
Yeah.
I've had people take risks and do some things that I would never have done, but they did it under my watch, and I've had to go back and say, "God bless," and I'm really glad you took that risk. It didn't work out, so now how do we learn from this, and what do we do next? How do we do this more effectively the next time? That I had to learn that. I didn't come with that. I had to learn that over time, and I made plenty of mistakes along the way. But I've learned that you get a lot further with people, particularly professionals, when you treat them as being in a practice where they are always learning, always growing, and they're going to make mistakes. It's okay.
Yeah.
I think that's how you nurture learning.
Okay. So I just want to point out, because I do want to emphasize positive examples. In the video game industry, that is one thing they do really well, is create that environment where they want you to take risk. It's okay to fail.
Yeah.
And we used to say at EA, I don't want you to replicate what somebody else has done. I want you to go do something that nobody's ever done, right? And that means we have to push the boundaries and take
Yeah.
risks. And so they were very comfortable with that, and it did make a huge difference. I mean, there were guys who
Oh,
got really excited because they were like, really? I can go try and build this thing, and if it doesn't work, it's okay. All right, let's
yeah.
go.
Yeah, and in some environments, you can really pull out all the stops, and I agree with you in that industry that you're not taking risks with people's lives. When you get into the healthcare industry or into,
Yeah.
academics, there are a few more boundaries than that. I don't want my surgeon who is holding a knife over me to decide to do something totally rogue while we're in surgery. It's like, no, don't do that to my body.
Yeah.
But as we kind of work our way through this, we do have to create an environment where learning by experience is absolutely valued. And
Mhm.
we've created a lot of control mechanisms that squelch that energy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a great point that, yes, obviously different environments and industries have different kind of guardrails you have to
Sure.
comply with, but you still got to try and find that what I learned to call a safe environment, right? Where Well, and one of the parts of that safety too, is that ability to speak up and say when
Yeah.
something's wrong or I don't agree or, I don't get it. All right, let's take a quick commercial break. I want to plug the Human Intelligence Movement. I do this on every episode. It's not a paid advertisement. It's just my passion for wanting to support this organization that does such a great service in our community. So the mission of the Human Intelligence Movement is to ensure that students have the skills to thrive and succeed in an AI world. So join the movement. There's a link in the show notes, so go do. Get involved. Now, let's get back to my conversation with Roger. We're going to talk about Disney and co-authorship as a strategy for onboarding wonderful teachers and for valuing those great teachers through proper compensation and intrinsic motivators. All right, keep listening. But you still got to try and find that, what I learned to call a safe environment, right? Where, well, and one of the parts of that safety too, is that ability to speak up and say when
Yeah.
something's wrong or I don't agree or, I don't get it, explain it
I'll
to
give
me
you
again, right?
Yeah, I'll give you a great story on that. In one of the organizations I was working in, we had a staff meeting. I convened a group of staff from all over the organization once a month, and it was a listening meeting, 2 hours every month. And over time, people got really comfortable coming into this, and no supervisors allowed, but they got really comfortable coming into this meeting and talking to me about the realities of their daily work. And it was also an opportunity for me to bring in an executive or two to say, okay, these are the vision and the goals of the organization. How can we do this more effectively?
Hmm.
Well, one of the meetings was all about cost control and how staff have a very important role in making sure that the financial energies of the organization were being well managed in a stewardship kind of a message. One of the people in the room was a stock handler in the warehouse. And he the next day encountered one of our vendors who was a soda machine vendor. They would come in with a truckload of soda and fill all the vending machines throughout the enterprise. And they did this once a week. And he caught the guy coming in and he said, you know what? Your soda is way too expensive, and we're in a cost control mode right now. And you need to do something to reduce your costs because our organization, we're trying to be more effective financially here. Now, this is a stockroom guy, okay? When the people in purchasing heard that he had done that, they wanted the guy crucified. And they complained to me that I was going rogue on them, and he had no authority to try to negotiate a deal with this vendor. And it went on for 2 days. And I finally decided I'm going to tell this story in the organization, and we're going to make this guy a hero. And we
Did he actually get a deal?
he got a deal. The vendor cut 20% off the cost of that shipment of soda as a result, and we created a much longer term contract because of this stockroom guy.
Yeah.
And the people in materials were totally hacked off by the whole thing. But this is the kind of stuff you run into. This young man felt like he had the power to go ahead and have that conversation. I'm
He had
glad he did.
ownership. Yeah,
And ownership.
yeah.
That was what we were trying to cultivate in the organization. So the following month, I wrote a piece in our bulletin describing the whole story and showcasing this guy as evidence of what we're trying to create in the organization.
Yeah.
Materials folks didn't like me for a while, but you live with that.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes you got to step on some toes along the way to, yes, influence an organization. Well, this is good stuff. I'm thoroughly enjoying all of this. So, well, I mentioned earlier that I worked at Disney, and you had given an example in the book. You called it the Disney way, and how some people are very professional there. And one of the things that, so for me, I was there 11 years. This is back in the 80s to the 90s. And a bunch of the folks that I worked with back then are still there. They're at like 35, 40 years with the company, and they have, stayed and been loyal and, dedicated employees, or cast members, as they call them at Disney. So what can we learn there from Disney, and what are they doing so well that maybe could also be applied to education or some of these other organizations?
I'm glad you brought Disney up. I still have my Mickey Mouse ears from my multiple sojourns through Disney. I brought 3 different executive groups through Disney's university process. So I found myself fairly well immersed in the Disney mindset and the customer service mindset Disney was teaching its staff to become as part of their gestalt. I also had the privilege of working with a couple of executives who did some time like you at Disney, and they won't reveal to me which costumes they wore, but they were there as cast members. The Disney experience was eye-opening in a couple of ways. Disney is all about visual perspective for the customer. As you well know, when you walk into the Magic Kingdom, the entire environment is very well choreographed. I was impressed going into their central casting area, whereas we walked through the columns in the front door, there were spider webs and all kinds of, creatures coming out of the woodwork. And it took a minute to realize it was all art. It was all deliberately on purpose. And we were in a Magic Kingdom. We were in a different place altogether. What I liked was the thoroughness of preparation and choreography around how people behaved. Disney has a lot of rules. They have a lot of expectations. When you're down in the dungeons of Disney and you're walking the halls down there and you see showcases that tell you how people are supposed to dress and how they're supposed to groom and how they're supposed to behave themselves. And when you're wandering in the dungeons, which is off stage, not on stage, and you encounter one of the Disney characters and they automatically go back into character because you are there and you are not part of the cast, it tells me how much discipline there is in their training and in how they function as an organization. I was impressed with the choreography, with the discipline, with the clarity of expectations that they had for the people working for the organization. And then beyond that, how well people felt treated. We had the opportunity to talk to a lot of the folks behind the scenes in the design area, in the graphics areas, in the planning areas. We had a chance to see how the place lit up in early hours of the morning when people were painting and cleaning and steaming and replacing burnout light bulbs and doing all the things that nobody ever sees, because their whole focus was the experience of the customer coming through the front gate. Their whole focus was that experience of the Magic Kingdom, of Epcot, of the different features of the Disney experience. That's why they call it the Disney Way. Not unlike the Toyota Way when we were getting into lean enterprise work. It is all about culture. It's all about creating a set of paradigms, beliefs, expectations, and behaviors. Disney is a master at cultural awareness. They're making I believe, some mistakes in today's world, and we can talk about that if you want. But in the reality of their enterprise, they are experts at establishing a culture of service, bar none. And when you go there with your kids, at my age, maybe the grandkids or the great grandkids, when you go there, you know you're going to get a Disney experience. Culture doesn't live in the rules on the wall. Culture doesn't live in the mission statement, the vision statement, or the core value statements that are hanging in the conference rooms. Culture lives in the minds and hearts of the people doing the daily work of the organization, and it affects their behavior. And I believe that Disney historically has understood that. I believe that they understood that the culture resides in the people doing the daily work. You could see it in their behavior every day. You
Yeah.
could see it in how the place is designed.
Yep. Well, I lived it. I can tell you it truly does get you, right? You have this sense for I'm going on stage now. This is a performance. I'm going on, whether you're in entertainment or you're in operations or you're in custodial, you're going on stage and there is this expectation. You go into that mode where, yes, I'm responsible for all of these people's experience and I have to take it seriously. And yes, they do a absolutely great job of that. But you mentioned vision. So how much of this, and I totally agree with you, it's not just about what you hang on the wall or what you get in your hiring package on boarding, right? It says these are the core values and the vision mission
Right.
statement, right? When you read it once and you put it in a drawer somewhere, you never think about it again. How about how do we really have that vision so that everybody kind of gets it every day, right? They know what the vision is, what the purpose, right? Your whole book, right? Lead with
Yeah.
purpose. How do we do that practically so it becomes embedded? It is part of the culture.
One word, co-authorship.
Co-authorship. Okay.
I have people coming to me all the time as a consultant. They say, okay, you're a cultural expert, you're an expert at motivation, you're an expert at leadership. I got all these people and I got this change that's coming and I need these people to buy into the change. How can you help me? And my response is it's too late. And after a moment of silence and kind of a glassy-eyed reaction, they asked me, what do you mean it's too late? I said, you can't have buy-in because you've already decided what you want to do. Now, if you're open to being influenced on that, I can bring together people for you and with you, and we can have a conversation about what you want and what they want. And maybe together we can come up with a better plan that everybody has co-authorship on.
Mhm.
That's how you get buy-in. You can't have buy-in by imposing a vision on somebody else. That's not going to happen. You have to have co-authorship.
Hmm.
A lot of leaders totally miss this. I did an engagement with a healthcare organization in a different state about 3 years ago. And when they brought a new CEO brought me in and said, I don't understand the culture of this place and I need somebody to help me figure it out. I've only been here a month and I'm confused. So I went in and I started talking with staff. I started wandering the halls and I asked people, do you have a mission statement? Do you have a vision statement? Do you have a core value statement? Well, yeah, somebody did that somewhere along the line. They had a consultant write that stuff up for us. It's hanging on a wall in one of the conference rooms.
Yeah.
So I went and looked at it, and what I found was disheartening. It was, yeah, it was clearly written by a consultant, and nobody could tell me what it said when I was wandering the halls. Nobody knew what it was. And how can you expect to have a vision if nobody knows what it is?
Hmm.
Co-authorship matters. My approach at that point was to junk the entire thing and start over. And what we did over 2 years was convene many focus groups, did a couple of surveys, and built a set of statements, including the core values, that hundreds of people had their fingerprints on.
Hmm.
It belonged to them. I didn't write it.
Yeah.
They wrote it. And now it's theirs.
Yeah.
And now when we're talking about strategy, they know the culture of the organization that strategy fits within. So, but you got to take the time. There's no fast way to do this. I, I've had the experience of other executives from other organizations coming in and saying, well, wow, you guys accomplished that in 5 years or 6 years. I'm going to go back to my shop and we're going to do it in two. Well, good luck with that. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
This is about relationships and lots of conversations and a lot of co-authorship over time. And
Yeah.
oh, by the way, not everybody's going to agree with one another.
All right. Let's talk about, oh, there's so many things. We could talk for hours here, Roger. There's the hiring side, right, of selecting people and well, I wrote a article once called Interviews Suck. Why do we hire people this way, right? Because in a 30-minute or an hour-long interview, you can't possibly know whether somebody really is a fit in your organization. So
Yeah.
let's assume, because most people are still hiring that way, that we're getting it wrong some of the time. And you actually describe in your book, the cynical ones and the you get some negative personality types in there, people who are toxic to that culture and
Cynics,
environment.
apathetics, and naysayers.
Right, there you go. Yes, apathetics and naysayers. I couldn't remember the term. So how do you go through that process, excuse me, of purging those folks, identifying them and getting them out?
Well, let's you want to focus on the positives as well as the negatives. So let's go to the positive here for a minute.
Okay.
The first thing you want to do is make sure you don't hire those folks. Okay. And
Easier said than done,
everybody,
Roger.
I know interviews suck, but what you have to do is create a process where people shine, but they also reveal who they are during that shining process. And so you can stage more than just a half-hour interview, particularly for highly expensive positions at the executive and management and senior professional practices like physicians or nurses or we, in my tenure as an executive, interviewing for a highly paid professional was a multi-day process, not a half-hour process.
Yeah.
And you really had to create a relationship with these people because you're making it's an annuity. When you're spending 70, 80, 90,000, $100,000 a year or much more on some of these professions, you've got an annuity in front of you that you better get right. So hiring the right people is critical. And I use interviews, I use focus groups, I use group interviews, I use assessment tools. There's a lot of things that are involved in that. Now you got them. They're on the team. They came hopefully motivated. They're not cynical. They're not apathetic. They want to do good work. And so now it's your job to nurture that and make sure that you give them all the tools and wherewithal they need to be wildly successful in their job. If you do that, the energy will flow. If you start overlaying on that expectations that they did not co-author, expectations that they didn't anticipate coming into the organization, rules and regulations that are counter to their professional practice, you're going to lose that energy. It's going to go away, and you will create cynicism. Most of the cynics, apathetics, and naysayers that I've met out in the real world of work got there for a reason. Now, it might have happened in a different organization, or it might have happened in my organization. Either way, I want to know what the reason is, because I can't fix it if I don't know the reason.
Right.
But you see it in behaviors. You see it in eye rolls. You see it in body language. You see it in the side conversations that take place sometimes. You see it in the rumor mill. You see it in how people start bringing back feedback and information to you. And what you have to do is you have to call people up front and you have to say, all right, what's going on with you? Why is this behavior occurring? And by the way, do you understand the impact you're having on the work of the business when you do this? The gossip, the blaming and shaming, the eye rolling, the body language, all has an effect on colleagues and coworkers. So what you have to do is you have to call people on their behavior and then ask them to change. Either they will or they won't. But where is the burden? The burden's not on management. The burden is on them to make a change. And if they don't make a change, you have to exact consequences. And in my mind, I don't have time to watch my back. I'm not going to do it in my career.
Yeah.
So I'll give you one warning, but if it continues, you're gone.
Yeah.
And if human resources wants to challenge me on that, I'll say, fine, they are now your employee. You figure out what to do with them because they're not going to be on my team.
Right.
Period.
Yeah.
Leaders have to be that defining as they work with people who are going through these things. Now, again, a lot of the cynicism, apathy, naysaying is usually there for a reason. And if you can get to the root causes of that, you might have to eat some crow and understand that your own practices are creating that effect in the workforce. Change your own practices if you have to. That's the humility part of this as being a leader.
Yeah. So, just glancing at some of my notes, there was so many other things in here. You talked quite a bit about compensation, and this is
Yeah.
a real problem in the teaching industry across the whole
Yeah.
sector. Teachers are underpaid. They're not compensated properly. They call it a compensation gap, where teachers are paid significantly less than equivalently educated folks in other industries. And I totally don't get it. I don't understand why we don't pay teachers enough. But you get some fundamental things like that that just break the system, right? It's so hard to keep
Yes.
people, engaged if they're underpaid and they don't feel that they're compensated fairly right from the get-go. It's a mountain to climb to try and solve that problem if you can't pay them properly.
Compensation is a value message. It tells me how much you value me. If I'm undercompensated, if I know that my colleagues in other school systems are making a lot more money on their contract than I'm making in my contract, I'm going to ask why. What happened in our negotiations that set that up? Am I getting better benefits than them? What was the trade-off? Because I'm not being compensated effectively. I've worked with teaching organizations where this is a significant issue. And what I found a couple of things that contribute to the problem. Thing number one is this short-term versus long-term expectations. School boards and school systems, they work on tax money, they work on resources that they consider limited. They seem to be able to find the resources to build new buildings and do all kinds of things, but for some reason they can't find the resources to compensate people properly.
Yeah.
Second, they rely on surveys, salary surveys, wage surveys to establish fair compensation. There's a problem with that. And I learned about that problem in my own work as an HR exec. Typically, when I got a salary survey on different kinds of positions, I learned that I had to ask how old the survey was because data changes. And if you're going to be competitive, a lot of people think, well, then I'm going to pay at the 50% compa ratio, which is roughly the middle of the curve. That's not competitive compensation because in most cases, the survey data is a year old or more. And the competitive dynamics in the marketplace is changing every day, especially in a highly competitive industry where people are short-staffed and trying to grab more and more talent. So if you're not paying at the 60 to 65% compa ratio, you're not competitive. You want to pay people so that they feel valued. If they don't feel valued by how you pay them, they're not going to be valued by anything else. Too often we've treated teachers, nurses, emergency rescue people, police officers as they're going to do what they're doing because of their goodwill. We don't have to compensate them as much because their goodwill makes them loyal to what we're doing here. I think that's blatantly unfair. Instead of treating them as lesser because of their goodwill, we ought to be treating them as more because of their goodwill. So there's kind of a inverse psychology going on there that's very mystifying to me. But if you want to keep good talent, you better pay them well. You better pay them in a way that tells them that they are valued as professionals.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're climbing up a hill, and why do that?
Yep.
So
All right.
I
Well, I
had
know
a
we're
well,
getting,
I had a mentor who told me once, never let money become the source of dissatisfaction. You do that, and you're in a death loop. You're gonna pay a big price. He was right.
yeah. Yeah. Sorry. I know we're almost at an hour, and I
Yep.
want to make
All
sure
right.
you get an opportunity to do your 5 principles and 2 actions, right? So,
You bet. What I learned in my work, and I'm asked all the time, how do we make sure that people understand this, and how do we make sure in a simple way that leaders understand what they have to do in order to cultivate a highly engaged workplace? And I keep telling people it's very simple. It's not as complicated and crazy as a lot of people want to make it. Make 5 promises and take 2 action steps, and you're going to be good as gold for a long time. So what are they? The 5 promises. And we've already talked about a lot of this stuff during the course of our conversation. Promise number 1, I will listen to you with respect, and I will take what you tell me seriously. I might disagree with you, and if I do, I'll tell you why. But your opinion matters to me, and I will listen to you with respect. When you convey that, people will talk with you if they believe you. Promise number 2, I will help you learn and grow as you practice your profession. Most people in professional work know that they're practicing their profession. And that word practice means exactly what it says. They're never done learning. They're never done experimenting. They're always practicing to become better and better at their profession. They want to be successful, and they want their boss to help them be successful. Number 3, I'll help you be wildly successful. I want the professionals working with me to be successful beyond their colleagues in other organizations. I want them to be wild. I want them bragging about the organization's support to their colleagues in other organizations. That's what I want. Promise number 4, I'll make sure you're compensated competitively. And we just talked about that.
mm,
That is more than just 50% comp ratio, and it's certainly more than 40% comp ratio, hoping for goodwill.
mm,
Promise number 5, I will have your back when things go south. Things are going to go south. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to do things that don't work out. We're going to have plans that don't realize. I'll have your back. We're not going to have blame and shame in our organization. That doesn't happen here. So those are the 5 promises. If you make those promises and then keep them, and that's the important part, you're going to generate a loyalty and a culture of openness that you can't generate any other way. People aren't going to want to leave that.
mm.
Why would they? Now, how do you act in that context? The first thing that I recommend that all leaders do is they have to do something called go and see. In lean enterprise work, that's called going together. You have to be present where the daily work is being done. That doesn't mean going out there and doing it with them. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, wandering through your organization, watching what's going on, listening to what's happening, and finding ways to help these professionals be wildly successful. I asked one teacher in a school system I was consulting with, when was the last time any one of your school board members sat in on your class? And she said, they don't know who I am. Nobody has ever come and done that.
Mm.
Well, if I were on a school board, that's one of the first things I would do is I would spend some time in the high school and the middle school and the elementary school. And I would sit and listen to the teachers and see how they're doing and get to know how things work. Why wouldn't a board member do that? But they don't.
Yep.
Go and see. Find out how things really work so that you can help. Then go and do. Now, by go and do, I'm not talking about solving the problems for people. I'm talking about giving them the resources so that they can solve their own problems. That's a big deal.
Mm.
Professionals want to solve their own problems. Teachers don't want a school board member to come in, see a problem, and then fix it. They want the school board member to come in and then give them the resources so they can fix it themselves.
Yeah.
Go and see, go and do. Those are the 2 action steps. Every chapter in my books end with the go and see and go and do something. The 5 promises are built into both books. It's important for people to create relationships. Those promises create relationships. Acting on the go and see and go and do solidifies those relationships. People get to know who you are, and they know that you're good for your word.
Awesome. This has been so much fun, and I love the promises and the actions. It's yes, we can have all the theory in the world, but if you don't roll up your sleeves and go, I agree. You got to listen. You got to be there.
Yep.
And yes, and that one in particular of, I've got your back. When you've got a boss who will help protect you, that, yes, they're not going to throw you under the bus when you've made a mistake. And yeah.
What a lot of people don't understand, Eric, is that leadership doesn't happen in the executive suite.
Yeah.
That's not where it happens. Planning happens there, but that's not leadership. Leadership happens in the relationships between the people doing the work and those guiding the work. That's where it happens.
Yep. Great. Well, any final last words, anything we didn't cover you were hoping we would talk about?
Actually, you covered it all. We kind of spoke around the edges on motivation and manipulation.
Yeah.
I see a lot of effort to motivate through incentives, and I have a deep-seated experiential belief that most incentives are manipulative programs, and we've got to stay with the intrinsics, not the extrinsics today.
Yeah. I love Daniel Pink's book Drive, and I know you cited that and some other sources in the book. So yes, intrinsic motivators, mastery, autonomy. Yes, those are really, really important concepts. So cool. Well, I thank you so much for your time. This has been, my pleasure in getting a chance to talk with you. When is the book going to be out? It's not.
Actually, the book is now out.
Oh, it is out.
It's available on Amazon, and actually the best way to get there is through my website. So rogergerard.com. And I've got links to all of my books. I've got links to the blogs that I post regularly on LinkedIn. I've got an assessment out there that people can play with. And there are a number of things that if you go to my website, rogergerard.com.
I will make sure that that link is in the show notes when we publish. So so people can find that. Awesome. Well, thank you again, and I hope you have a great day there. I'm going to go get cleaned up because it's nighttime here, but
it's nighttime for you. Yeah, have a good night.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Roger.
Eric.
All right. Yep. Okay. I hope you really enjoyed that. I certainly did. And I want to take a moment here and just recap Roger's 5 promises and 2 actions because they're just so important as takeaways from this conversation. Okay, so you need to promise to listen with respect, okay? You need to help teachers grow and develop, to support their success, and to value them by compensating them properly, and maybe most importantly, to have their back so they feel safe. So those are the 5 promises. The 2 actions, this is really simple. Go and see and go and do. Right? You can't lead with purpose from your office. You got to get out there, get hands-on, talk to people, observe, see them in their natural environment as they're teaching. Okay? So there's a link in the show notes to Roger's website where you can get copies of his books and request to talk with him or interact with him. So please check that out. We really all need to embrace this and put his words of wisdom and his practical advice into action. I'm Eric Byron. Thanks for listening to the Education Innovators Podcast. I'm so glad you're here. We have great stuff coming up, many more guests lined up. So continuing with season 3. So hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss any of it. And to all those education innovators out there, keep doing what you're doing. You are making a difference.